Now we're going to bring up our keynote speaker, is Dr. Rodney Sampson. He is the CEO of OHUB and is heralded as the leading inclusive ecosystem builder in the world, particularly his mission to ensure that undertapped communities have equitable access to multi-generational wealth creation opportunities afforded in the innovation economy, as defined paths to reducing poverty and racial wealth gaps everywhere. He is the head of diversity at ABC's hit TV show Shark Tank. He is a senior fellow, Brookings Institution, professor at Duke, UNC, and Morehouse. And Dr. Sampson founded the HBCU at South by Southwest in 2016, and he brought 500 HBCU students to South by Southwest, and 90% of them were hired. So please help me welcome Dr. Rodney Sampson.
Why don't you all give yourselves a hand for creating change? I often say that when we get to have conversations like this is sort of a signal or a reflection on the work. A lot of people think conversations are the work, but they aren't. It's real work that actually happens every day in terms of legislation and the relationships that are required to actually move legislation forward and get it passed and get it signed, and then the real work definitely begins. And we are definitely in an unprecedented time in history. When you just look at the current administration, you look at the federal legislation that has been passed, even going back to ARPA, and the renewal of the state small business credit initiative, and you look at the CHIPS bill, which has tech hubs and the cybersecurity opportunity act. You look at NSF engines. There's so much legislation that hopefully will account for what some of the private sector has said they were going to do, especially in 2020. We had a lot of folks that said a lot of things in 2020, and now we're not there. But I think this federal legislation gives us an opportunity to actually create some of that equity and parity that we've been talking about. But to go back in history a little bit, I'm also excited that my wife of 24 years is with me this evening. So I started my first technology company in 2000. And to give you a little kind of tech startup adventure history, because actually Maryland, particularly Baltimore, plays a role in that. There were 3 black founders in the late 90s, early 2000s that had raised in excess of $1 million in venture capital. There was Omar Wassel with Black Planet. You don't have to tell us if you had a Black Planet profile. Omar raised over $4 million and had an exit from his company. I co-founded a company called Multicast Media Technologies, and we were innovators of what then became known, or eventually became known as streaming technologies. It was called IPTV back then. And we had a vertical for churches called Streaming Faith. I think one of our first, y'all remember Streaming Faith? One of the first pastors in this region was Dr. Jamal Bryant, in Atlanta. He was one of the Preach Black Men Preach on Streaming Faith. We raised over $4 million, and that company was acquired as well. And then there was Clarence Wu. Some of you might know Clarence and his company that was in this region. And now Clarence had an exit as well. So when you look at the math and you look at black founders who were actually able to raise early stage, high risk venture capital, when we were trusted with those funds, the data reflected that we were able to return that capital and make money for our respective investors as well. So that was my first startup. The first 10 years of my career was as a founder, as an operator. And in around 2010, things started to shift. Building high growth companies is very, very hard. It's like wearing the hat of a policymaker and an operator of a business at the same time. You're making key decisions. You're working in the business and on the business when you work on a high growth startup. And so I started to want more in terms of what Napoleon Hill calls definitive purpose. Why was I created? Why, had I been afforded the privilege to be lucky enough to even know what venture capital was, and to know what software engineering was, and to know what go-to-market was, and have enough relationships to stumble really into the right place, and came to understand that, yes, I was black, yes, I was in Atlanta, but when I became a high-growth founder with venture capital, I then became privileged, and it wasn't enough for me to be the only one. And so we started working on a concept called Opportunity Hub. And right before Opportunity Hub, I have to update the bio a little bit. I actually was the head of diversity at ABC Shark Tank from 2013 to 2015, and then I passed that mantle on to Brandon Andrews at Values Partnership, who resides in the DMV area to this day. Right before that, I published my fourth book, Keynote, 12 Innovative Currencies for Transforming Your Business and Life. I guess some of you read that, inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So that became a philosophical framework for how we could participate in the innovation economy at scale. But in 2013, Opportunity Hub was born, and we were really the first kind of multi-campus Black technology hub, co-working space. No one was really saying ecosystem then, and it sort of kind of evolved over that period. So Opportunity Hub has continued to scale. We started off as placemaking, but we added programming very quickly. So we went from placemaking to programming. Programming included one of the nation's first full-stack software development programs, which was the model for the Tech Hire Initiative in the Obama administration. From there, we added our first pre-accelerator. We were one of the first Black pre-accelerators in the country, one of the first Black incubators in the country. And then, if you work with enough founders, and they start asking you for money. So you're either going to, put up or shut up, right, and start writing some checks. And so we started making some early bets, and I think today we are collecting about 7 venture funds, probably 120 startups. I'll wrap this up by, I'm a big believer in codification of your work because it can then become a model for others. And so I was fortunate to join Brookings Institution as a non-resident senior fellow. Visiting professor at UNC, Duke, and Morehouse. Was one of the first entrepreneurship professors at Morehouse as well. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. We could wrap it up there, but I'm going to ask a couple more questions. Have you done any work with the federal government on equity?
That's an interesting question. A lot of us that do this work, a lot of times we do it in stealth and we don't use the buzzwords of the season. Before the Biden administration, the previous administrations, it was inclusion, it was fairness, it was all kind of like this kumbaya language, and no one was really addressing the systemic issues that Black Americans in particular and other undertapped communities that experience in America because of systemic issues that we still candidly navigate to this day. And so as of late, we absolutely have a piece of legislation I was really proud of because it was really grassroots and it was really bipartisan, was the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. And it became known as the Equity Crowdfunding Bill. And it was originally called Equity Crowdfunding Bill. At the time, Speaker Boehner got together with the White House in the 11th hour because the bill was about to be dead. And they changed it to jobs. Like, who wouldn't vote for jobs? And so Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act actually passed as one of the most bipartisan pieces of legislation in both terms of the Obama administration. Affordable Healthcare Act was one, and then the Jobs Act was another. Lately, I've had the opportunity, I worked specifically on, before it became known as CHIPS and Tech Hubs, it was called Endless Frontier Act. Congressman Schumer, Ro Khanna out of Silicon Valley, that's his district, they put forth tech hubs. And the equity piece that we put in that particular piece of legislation was that at least one of the multi-billion-dollar tech hubs that's forthcoming would have to be in a region that had a density of HBCUs and MSIs. So automatically, that means Baltimore could be a city, DC, Atlanta, the Raleigh-Durham area, New Orleans, and Houston. It's only a few cities that have a density of HBCUs. We work with Congressman Hank Johnson on the Cybersecurity and Opportunity Act, which also drives more resources to HBCUs as well. We go back to the Obama administration when Senator Mary Landrieu was running the U.S. Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. the State Small Business Credit Initiative 1, which Maryland participated in, was an early adopter with TEDCO. And TEDCO led the way definitely on the venture side as well, so kudos to you all on that. Participated in a couple congressional hearings. This time around, we were able to work initially a little behind the scenes navigating. It was going to be racial equity. A little disappointing because the administration ran on racial equity, but what we all learned is the appointees come in and they run into the people who've been there for decades. And so the legislation starts to get watered down because people don't think they can reach the goals, right? They don't see, they don't live, they don't hear the stories. They don't know that there are, tens of thousands of fundable black founders in this country right now ready to get a check. There are thousands in Maryland. Lou Cooper shouldn't be the only one that raises $6 million and has a successful exit. There are hundreds or more just in Baltimore alone. But when people don't see that, they tend to dilute it so that they can reach their goals and metrics. And so racial equity became SED, socially economic disadvantaged individuals. And we all now can say the acronym, but we're still getting used to it because we were fighting for racial equity. But the long story of that is it's like the work continues within the work. And so I've just been privileged the opportunity. And I think growing up in Atlanta really helped to shape my worldview that policy is precedent in everything. And a lot of times the tech startup and venture ecosystem has tried to work outside of politics, and then they run into some regulatory issues and get yanked, into the carpet. And what I've realized is that truly, and just sincerely, almost 25 years in this ecosystem, the private sector has disappointed us every time. We all we got, and we got to make sure that we are in policy positions to actually drive equitable policy that drives us into the fourth industrial revolution.
What's the difference when investing in black companies and invest the world monetary wise? What's the difference?
I love investing in black companies. Right now, our venture fund, 100 Black Angels and Allies, we exclusively invest in black companies. I actually fundamentally believe that as a limited partner in a fund or as an investor in a company, you're breaching your fiduciary duty if you don't invest in black men, and specifically black women, because if your job as a VC is to return principal, reach alpha, there's no way you can do it without diversifying your portfolio. And when you trust people who have not had with something, if you allow it to innovate without restrictions, you see the world. So when I look at our macro portfolio and I look at who's actually performing, like who's still thriving, through this, perceived economic downturn, predicted perhaps to be a recession, kind of self-prophesying recession that's happening, with all the layoffs that, companies, why are you laying off when you got 56 billion in the bank? But that's another conversation. But my point there is, investing in Black is just fiduciary. It's just a fiduciary in terms of return on capital. At the same time, you have to bring a cultural competency to the table, because Black founders and founders in general that have not had access to capital, and a lot of this, not exclusively, but also applies to the intersectionality of women founders, LGBTQIA founders, rural communities, indigenous communities. And so when you're dealing with founders who are innovating based upon their experiences and their exposure and their subject matter expertise, there's nothing that we can't win when we're allowed to expose it and work on solving it. And so when you think about, women like Janice Brown Howard, first Black woman to build $1 billion company from the ground up. Many people think it's a staffing company only, but it's really a software company. When you think about Emmett McHenry, who actually still lives in Maryland today. I don't know if you all know Emmett, but Emmett was the co-creator of what's called TCP/IP. TCP/IP is the software engineering protocol that allows devices to talk to one another. Like, your apps would not work without TCP/IP. He also was the creator of domain names, with the development of network solutions. And so when you see that there are Black people that have actually shaped the infrastructure. I think of Dr. Lonnie Johnson in Atlanta. Most people know him for the Super Soaker, but they don't know about the 100 energy packets that he owns. And you can talk to Lonnie and just casually walking through his 80,000 square foot, lab in downtown Atlanta that most people don't even know exists. And Lonnie's like, "What you working on, Lonnie?" "I'm working on intergalactic space travel with NASA." He said that like, "Hey, I'm gonna catch an Uber back to Baltimore." And so the more we can expose people who have been oppressed, depressed, and left out, there's nothing we cannot solve. So when you talk about the imperative around diversity incubators, I'm going to expand that a little bit for you into what I call the DAIS incubator, diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions, right? Solutions require funding. And if your diversity, equity, and inclusion is not funded, it's performative, right? And we know there's a lot of performances. So I want to encourage you all as you roll out this, diversity incubator construct in the state, continue to build upon it and hold the people that get the money accountable. Because what we've noticed in the last 2 years is that people who like making money are not shameful for going where the money is. And if the money is in diversity right now, people who have no background or no contextual relationship to diversity will be applying and showing up. And you want to make sure that people are held accountable and that collaboration happens and that this is just not a money grab. I mean, I'm seeing proposals, I'm hearing about proposals for all this federal money. There are folks that are applying for hundreds of millions of dollars, checking diversity boxes, and have no precedence and no track record. And I'll leave you with this piece. I would love for it to be my state, but it could be your state. What's going to be the Black state, the state where Black, brown, indigenous people who've been left behind and say, I want to move to that state because there's capital, there's contracts, there's opportunities in that respective state. We all look to Silicon Valley as this meritocracy model. It isn't. It is a false meritocracy, and it wouldn't be a Silicon Valley without an East Palo Alto that was Black and a King Coleman who was Black. There wouldn't be a Silicon Valley without the police and firefighters pension funds that funded the infrastructure for the early incubators, funded the infrastructure for the early stage venture funds. I mean, they literally took some of the hard-earned money for teachers, police, and firefighters and invested a small percentage of it in an asset class where most of us, when we write the check, we turn our backs because we really don't expect to see the money back. Okay? And when we do, it's some type of unicorn or zebra, or now they call them dragons. They got different names for different levels. But my point there is the models of how everyday people who help to protect and serve are not getting the credit for one of the nation's most, incredible tech hubs, even with all of its respective problems. But folks aren't moving to Silicon Valley and San Francisco because of diversity. They're only moving there because that's where the density of capital is. 75% of the capital in this country is in 3 states: California, New York, and Massachusetts, particularly New York City, particularly Boston, and San Francisco. The rest of the country competes over 25% of the capital. And so when you start to shift that with these type of bills, when you start to shift that with 100 million here, 50 million there, 50 million there, it starts to add up. And the founders and the people that are solving the hardest problems on this planet today start to attract to one another. The one thing that made San Francisco, from the time I even spent there, was the serendipity of running, just like bumping into that. It's almost like running into your colleagues at the State House, right? The density of you all being there 2 months out of the year is what allows you to get stuff done. And then you work on that for the rest of the year. And so you create that density of serendipity in these diversity incubators, but you don't just need diversity incubators. You got to have, diversity coding boot camps, because it starts with the talent. The state should have 100,000, black and brown software engineers that know how to code, right? You got to start with the talent. You should have 50,000 salespeople, 50,000 cybersecurity specialists, data analysts. And when you bring workforce into the picture, the young people and the mature people that are repositioning themselves for workforce, they will trust what you expose them to. So you can expose them to a career at a call center, or you can expose them to building mobile applications. And when you build that infrastructure of talent and you surround it with access to early stage non-resource capital, unfortunately, bank lending and loans are not going to solve this issue, because most of these companies don't have revenue yet, and so they can't service the debt. And so early stage, high risk capital and infusion of that type of capital at all levels is really what will position the state for the future.